Non-point source data collection. So again, we're looking at something like a road here, the road itself as a non-point. So again, the process leads to the SEC selection. And this could include gasoline storage tank refilling, for example. If this is at a gas station and you're treating your gas stations as non-point sources because you have 3 of them, for example, and it's easier to do it that way. Unpaved roads is an example of another operation. And the activity data, for example, for a gasoline storage tank refilling, that would be a process of either splash filling or submerged filling. And the activity data needed for the operation of an unpaved road would include vehicle miles traveled, so that's one vehicle traveling how many miles, the vehicle weight, the speed in terms of categories of average speed, the road silt content, and keep in mind that this information is available either through documents that we can provide or links that are in the notes document for this module. Then, of course, obviously important is if there's any control measures to reduce the pollutant that's being emitted. So, for example, for unpaved roads, using water to reduce the dust or spraying oil to reduce the dust. In terms of TICE, where this data goes for non-point sources, obviously the location, and that is just the entire area, which for on-reservation sources would be your reservation or tribal land. And if you're looking at data from the NEI, then the area of the non-point source, the location of the non-point source, would be perhaps a county, for example. The process is very critical because usually the process leads to the source classification code, which leads to the estimator, the choice of what is used for the emission factor and the calculations, often is determined by the process. Control equipment, the time period, usually annually, and also take a look carefully and remember that when you access the estimator button, it is from the time period, and then that data gets imported into TICE. So that's one of the several reasons why the time period is very critical. And then the emissions, and if you're obtaining this data from another source, such as a county, that could be entered into TICE, or if you use TICE to calculate the emissions, that's obviously a data element. So for mobile sources, there are on-road mobile sources and off-road mobile sources. For on-road mobile sources, there is not a calculator in TICE now that calculates emissions from on-road sources for most emissions. But EPA does recommend a model called MOVES for on-road emissions and non-road for non-road emissions. And right now, we don't have the training and the time to get such training to run such models for you. So what is being done pretty much universally, as far as we know, is Angelique has devised ingenious method for getting the data directly from EPA, and she's corresponded with the person at EPA to get the most up-to-date data for you. And the entire of Module 16, which is an amazing module, goes over the method of basically scaling down the emissions for your reservation. So for example, if your land occupies 1/10 of the county land and there are 1/10 of the road lengths and vehicle traffic, if all that were perfectly 1/10, then the emissions in all the different categories could be scaled down to be 10% of the counties, and that could be the data that then is used in your emissions inventory for emissions for those cars when they're running across the land on your tribal land. It's usually quite a bit more complicated than that, and Module 16 goes over how Angelique has devised various methods for scaling down those emissions from a larger jurisdiction. So right now, that is the option that we can make available to you, but feel free to get the training, these models, and help us if you can get that training. For off-road mobile sources, there are calculators in TICE for some types of off-road sources. Obviously, the type of engine is critical if it's a two-stroke lawnmower or some big giant diesel engine of a bulldozer. The horsepower is critical because that relates directly to how much of the fuel is burned. And then the hours of use. So for example, snowmobiles would not be used year-round. And it's vital to understand and know the model that was used to estimate the emissions. And we'll talk about potential double counting more in Module 16, but you need to be educated about what data you're getting and what model they used. In terms of TICE, where the data for mobile sources goes, obviously the location, and if you're looking at just tribal land and the activity from sources on tribal land, then the location would just be the tribal land. If you're looking at county level data from the NEI database, then the location would be a county. The processes are obviously critical. Sometimes there's more than one. The time period of the emissions, and then the actual emission values themselves. And these could be based again upon looking at the proportion of road lengths and the types of the emissions from a larger jurisdiction and scaling them down to the road lengths and types on your tribal land, or if you're looking at EPA models, what the actual emissions values are. In terms of fire, fires are a special case. They cover a large land area like a non-point source, but they have a defined location like a point source. The important elements of data for fires are the dates, the coordinate, where it is located at, and then its impact over what non-point area, the fire type, and the acres burned. And the new EPA formats and TICE treat fires as events. There is potential developments at EPA to completely handle fire events and then provide the data, similar to what they do for airports, to provide the data for people then to look at the emissions and perhaps use them in their emissions inventories in that scaled down fashion. And we will assist you and keep you apprised of that. In terms of TICE, so obviously the name of the fire, the dates of the fire, so the location, and again keep in mind the differentiation between your tribal land and if you're looking at estimates that were produced for a larger jurisdiction, the geographic coordinates, the process in terms of was this an intentional fire or was this a wildfire, and then the actual emissions estimates. Homework. Look carefully at your potential non-point sources and list them in an email to us, what non-point sources you plan to include. This would also be in your quality assurance project plan. Again, keep in mind that you're not bound by what you submit to us, of course, either as homework or even what you put in your QAPP. It's important that you just keep moving on the project. Review the example QAPP and open up TICE and look at your list of non-point sources and write out the estimation methods that you plan to use for the non-point sources that you're looking at. You would use this information to complete the non-point table in the QAPP template, and this is an example of what it could look like. This is the category, so unpaved road dust, paved road dust, residential wood burning stoves, and then written out is the method and the data that's needed, and this can be obtained directly out of TICE when you look at what we talked to you about in the earlier module about the information that's available to you from within the calculators. Your homework due in 5 days is to complete your quality assurance project plan, looking especially at non-point sources. You know that you can always send us drafts and you can send us draft sections, and here's a picture of somebody at Pets for Patriots. And we look forward to receiving your homework and getting your emails and questions.